The Galactic Council chamber fell into a deep silence as Morgoth, the Eternal, raised her pale hand and pointed at the gathered representatives from across the stars, and her voice cut through the air like a blade as she commanded them all to kneel before her ancient throne and show their submission to her eternal rule for 3,000 years. She had ruled the 7 spiral arms of the galaxy with absolute power, and her undead fleets had consumed world after world and turned entire civilizations into her servants, and now representatives from 1,000 conquered species bowed their heads and bent their knees before her obsidian throne and bared their necks in the traditional sign of surrender. All, except one person in the entire chamber, remained standing. Lieutenant Kate Morrison stood with her arms crossed over her chest in her human military uniform. It looked plain and simple compared to the ornate robes and ceremonial armor that surrounded her on all sides, and she had been sent by Earth Command as an observer to this gathering, and nothing more than that. But when Morgoth turned her burning crimson eyes upon Kate and demanded that she bow like all the others, Kate set her jaw firm and refused to move. Morgoth spoke again, and her voice echoed through the massive chamber like rolling thunder, and shadows seemed to writhe and twist around her body like living creatures as she repeated her command and told the human to kneel before her. Kate looked directly into those ancient eyes and spoke a single word in response, and that word was Noth. Chamber erupted in gasps and horrified whispers from every corner, and no one had defied Morgoth in living memory, and the last species to resist her rule had been the Velcrin Empire, and their homeworld was now a barren wasteland, orbiting a dying star, and everyone knew what happened to those who challenged the vampire. Queen Morgoth rose slowly from her throne and descended the steps with movements that seemed more like floating than walking, and she savored each moment as she approached the defiant human and studied her with eyes that had witnessed the death of gods and the fall of empires. The vampire queen spoke and told Kate that she had ended entire civilizations and drunk the blood of beings of immense power, and the entire human species existed only because Morgoth had not yet bothered to notice them. And soon that would change. Kate met that terrible gaze without flinching even once and told Morgoth that she knew exactly what the vampire queen was, and she also knew what humans were, and humans did not kneel to tyrants, no matter how old or powerful those tyrants might be. Before Morgoth could respond to this insult, a sudden commotion erupted from the eastern gallery of the chamber, and a figure emerged from the shadows, moving with grace and purpose. And she was tall and ethereal, with silver hair that seemed to glow with its own inner light, and she wore armor that looked like it was made from captured starlight itself, and she carried a blade that hummed with ancient power. Lyra, Moonwhisper, stepped into the light, and she was the last free elf in the known galaxy, and beside her walked a massive dragon with scales like polished obsidian, and eyes that burned like molten gold, and the dragon spread its enormous wings and filled half the chamber with its presence. Lyra spoke, and her voice rang clear and musical through the hall, yet it carried an edge as sharp as winter ice, and she addressed Morgoth directly and told her that her reign of terror would end this day, and Lyra had found the one that the ancient prophecies had spoken of. And this was the one who could not be turned by vampire bite, and the one who would never kneel. Morgoth narrowed her eyes as she looked between the elf warrior and the human soldier, and she declared that the prophecy was nothing but a myth, and no such being could possibly exist in reality. Lyra smiled slightly and asked a simple question. And that question was, if the prophecy meant nothing, then why was Morgoth afraid? The dragon, whose name was Shadowfang, had not spoken in 500 years, and not since the elven homeworld of Silverglade had fallen to Morgoth and been consumed by her endless night. But as he looked upon Kate Morrison and saw this small, stubborn human who refused to bow, something ancient stirred deep within his massive chest. Shadowfang lowered his enormous head until his golden eyes were level with Kate, and he spoke for the first time in centuries and told her that Lyra spoke the truth, and he could see it now, and he could see the mark of the unbroken upon her soul. Kate had no idea what any of them were talking about, because she was just a military officer sent to observe and take notes, and she was not some prophesied hero from ancient legends, but she knew an opportunity. When she saw one, and if this elf warrior and her dragon were enemies of Morgoth, then Earth desperately needed them. As Ali Slira leaned close and whispered so that only Kate could hear, and told her to meet them at the old abandoned trade station on Pyre 7, and they would have much to discuss about the future. Morgoth released her fury in a wave of psychic energy that knocked lesser beings to the floor and sent them sprawling, and she screamed for her Crimson Guard to seize all three of the rebels immediately, but Shadowfang released a roar that shook the very foundations of the council station itself, and purple flames erupted from his massive jaws, and these were not normal dragon flames, but ancient magic fire that seemed to burn reality itself, and the vampire guards recoiled in fear because their supernatural forms were vulnerable to this old power. In the chaos that followed, Lyra grabbed Kate by the arm and shouted for her to run, and they sprinted through the corridors of the station with Shadowfang smashing through walls behind them and creating a path of destruction that delayed their pursuers and bought them precious time. They would never make it to Kate's shuttle in Docking Bay 17. So Lyra pulled Kate into a maintenance shaft, and somehow Shadowfang compressed his massive dragon body to fit inside, using his ancient magic to bend space in ways that should have been impossible. They climbed down into the lower levels of the station, where the air recyclers hummed constantly in maintenance. Robots scuttled through the darkness, and they finally stopped to catch their breath. Kate asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the moment Lyra appeared, and she wanted to know what prophecy they kept talking about and what mark they claimed. As Silas studied Kate carefully with her silver eyes and explained that 3,000 years ago, when Morgoth first rose to power, the last oracle of the elven people had seen a vision of the future, and in that vision was a being from a world that Morgoth had never touched, and this being had blood that the vampire queen could not drink, and a will that she could not break, and this person would unite the scattered resistance across the galaxy and end her reign forever. Kate laughed bitterly and told them she was just a soldier doing her job, and she had been sent to the council to take notes and write reports, and not to start some kind of galaxy-wide revolution. Shadowfang spoke again, and his deep voice sounded like mountains speaking, and he told Kate that she had stood when everyone else knelt, and asked if she knew why Morgoth could control so many different species. Dragon explained that Morgoth's bite did not merely drain blood from her victims, but created a psychic bond and a compulsion to serve her will, in every species in the galaxy shared a common genetic ancestor, and that heritage made them all vulnerable to her power. But humans were different. Kate's world had evolved separately from all the others, and humans were immune to Morgoth's control. The implications of this hit Kate like a physical blow, and she realized that if this was true, then Earth was not just another potential victim on Morgoth's list, but rather the greatest threat to her entire empire. Emperor Kate whispered that Morgoth would come for them. And come for Earth? Lyra confirmed this grimly and told Kate that the Vampire Queen was already gathering her Crimson Fleet, and that was why Morgoth had summoned all the council representatives, because she wanted to identify which species had sent humans, and now she knew exactly where to find them. Kate reached for her communicator, but Lyra stopped her hand and told her it was too late for warnings, because the fleet would reach Earth in 7 days, but there was another way to stop this. Lyra pulled out an ancient crystal from her armor, and its surface was covered in runes that seemed to shift and move on their own, and she explained that this crystal contained the locations of Morgoth's 3 sister queens, and if they could kill these 3 powerful vampires, then Morgoth's power would weaken enough for her to be challenged directly. The elf continued and said that the resistance scattered across the galaxy would rise up when they saw the sister queens fall, and then they would finally have a real chance to defeat the vampire empire. And Kit did the calculations in her head and realized they needed to kill 3 queens in 7 days, and she said out loud that this was impossible, and they would need an entire army to accomplish such a task. Shadowfang's laugh sounded like an avalanche rolling down a mountain, and he told Kate they had something better than an army, and they had the Unbroken One, and the last free elf, and a very angry dragon, and together that was the beginning of a legend. Pyre 7 was a dying world, and its sun had collapsed long ago to a red dwarf star that painted everything in deep shades of blood, and the old trade station orbited in complete silence. because it had been abandoned. After Morgoth's conquest 30 years before, and it was the perfect hiding place for fugitives running from the vampire Queen Kate's shuttle docked without any problems because its stealth systems were a gift from Lyra's advanced elven technology. And inside the station, they found a war room that Lyra had been preparing for years, and secret star maps covered every wall and red marks indicated Morgoth's territory, which was almost the entire galaxy, and 3 pulsing blue points marked there. Targets. Lyra pointed to the first location and explained that Seraphine, the Pale, held the Outer Rim territories, and she commanded the entire vampire fleet and all their blood-forged weapons. And if they killed her then? Wood Crumble, the elf, pointed to the second target and said that Cassandra, the Whisper, ruled the inner colonies, and her power was subterfuge and infiltration, and she had spies in every court and every government across the galaxy. And if they eliminated her, then the Resistance could finally coordinate their efforts. Without fear of betrayal, Kate asked about the third target. Lyra's expression grew dark and troubled, and she told Kate about Victoria the Dread, who held the prison world of Ashfallen. This was where Morgoth kept her most dangerous captives locked away, and these prisoners included warriors and scientists and leaders who might threaten her rule. And if they freed these prisoners and killed Victoria, then they would gain an instant. Shadowfang studied the star maps with his ancient eyes and said they should strike at Seraphine first because cutting off the head would weaken the body, but they could not simply fly in and attack directly because even with his great power, they would be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Kate paced around the room as her military training took over, and she told them they should not attack at all, but instead they should infiltrate. And she asked Lyra if she could make Kate look like one of Morgoth's servants using magic. Lyra considered this carefully and said she could cast a glamour spell to change Kate's appearance, but the spell would not hold if Seraphine got too close, because the vampire queen would sense that Kate was different from other vampires. Kate said they would make sure Seraphine did not get close until it was too late, and she asked what the one thing vampire queens valued above everything else. Shadowfang rumbled that they valued power most of all. Kate shook her head and corrected him and said they valued loyalty above power because they needed servants they could trust absolutely, and she proposed offering Seraphine something she could not possibly resist, which was intelligence about a threat to Morgoth, and they would claim that a human fleet was preparing to attack the vampire empire. Lyra understood the plan immediately and said they would create a trap within a trap and feed Seraphine false information to get close enough to strike. And when she was dead, they would take her flagship and use it to reach Cassandra. Kate turned to Shadowfang and asked if he could hide himself and make himself appear smaller. The dragon's massive form shimmered, and suddenly a small obsidian cat sat where the enormous beast had been just moments before, and its eyes still glowed with golden fire, and Shadowfang said in his deep voice that he was ancient and knew many forms. The next 2 days, they prepared for the mission, and Lyra taught Kate the basic customs of vampire courts and how to bow without actually kneeling, and how to speak in the flowery language that vampires preferred when addressing each other. The hardest part of the preparation was casting the glamour spell, and Lyra's magic washed over Kate like freezing cold water, and when Kate looked in a mirror, she saw a pale woman with dark hair and crimson eyes and elongated fangs, and she looked like she had been turned into a vampire about 50 years ago, which was young enough to seem ambitious, but old enough to be useful, Ira warned Kate to remember that the glamour only changed her appearance and not her actual biology, and if Seraphine tried to drink Kate's blood, then the vampire queen would know immediately that something was wrong, and Kate must not let Seraphine touch her under any circumstances. Their ship was a stolen vampire cruiser that Lyra had secretly acquired years before, and it approached Seraphine's enormous flagship without raising any alarms, and the massive dreadnought called the Blood Eternal hung in space like a dark monument to death itself, and its hull was crafted from compressed remains of destroyed worlds, and weapons covered every surface. Kate's hands remained steady on the communications console as she sent a message and identified herself as an envoy, Mara, requesting an audience with the Pale Queen and claiming she brought urgent intelligence regarding the human threat to the Empire. The response came back quickly and told Envoy Mara to approach because the pale Queen would see her immediately as their small ship entered the vast docking bay. Kate exchanged meaningful glances with Lyra and Shadowfang in his cat form, and this was the moment of truth and the first step in what seemed like an impossible mission. The hunt for the three sister queens had officially begun. The interior of the Blood Eternal was like walking through a nightmare made real in walls of living metal, pulsed with crimson light that seemed to breathe, and the air itself whispered with voices of consumed souls. And Kate walked through the dark corridors with fake confidence while Shadowfang in his cat form perched on her shoulder, and Lyra remained hidden back in their ship, ready to strike if anything went wrong. Seraphine's throne room was a vast chamber that opened directly to the void of space, and only shimmering energy fields protected it from the vacuum, and the pale queen herself sat on a throne made entirely of bones, and she was terrifying in her cold beauty, with skin like fresh snow and hair like spun platinum, and eyes that had witnessed the death of countless stars. The vampire queen watched Kate approach with the interest of a predator studying potential prey, and she spoke in a voice like silk over steel and asked what Envoy Mara could possibly know that her vast intelligence network did not already know about the human's gate. Bowed slightly but did not kneel, and she played the part of an ambitious young vampire perfectly, and told Seraphine that she had been part of a reconnaissance mission to Earth before Morgoth's summons, and the humans were far more dangerous than anyone suspected. Kate explained that the humans were building new weapons, and not just conventional arms, but something they called antimatter bombs, and these were weapons powerful enough to destroy entire vampire fleets in single explosions. This information was partially true because Earth did have antimatter research programs, although nothing had been weaponized yet, but the lie was close enough to truth to sound believable to someone who wanted to believe it. Seraphine leaned forward on her bone throne, and her interest was clearly growing, and she questioned whether antimatter weapons were even possible because such technology required knowledge beyond what humans should possess. Kane continued the deception and told her that humans had found allies among survivors from species that Morgoth thought she had completely wiped out, and these survivors were sharing their advanced knowledge and technology. And in 6 months, or maybe less, Earth would become completely untouchable. The pale Queen's expression shifted from casual interest to genuine concern, because this was exactly the kind of threat that would worry her deeply, and if Morgoth failed to conquer Earth and the humans became a rallying point for resistance movements across the galaxy, then Seraphine's position as supreme military commander would be in serious jeopardy. Seraphine asked why Kate had brought this information to her. Instead of going directly to Morgoth with such important intelligence, Kate answered carefully and said she was bringing this to the one who actually commanded all the fleets, and to the one who could act swiftly and decisively, and she implied that Morgoth was too occupied with council politics, and by the time the vampire queen mobilized her forces, it might already be too late, but Seraphine could launch a preemptive strike and destroy Earth before it became a real threat, and all the glory of that victory would belong to her. Along greed and ambition flickered in Seraphine's ancient eyes like distant lightning, and Kate could see the calculations happening behind that beautiful face as the vampire queen weighed risks against potential reward. Seraphine commanded Kate to show her proof of these weapons. Kate had anticipated this demand, and she pulled out a datapad containing fabricated images and fake intelligence reports that Lyra had helped her create and forge. In the documents looked convincing and detailed enough to fool someone who desperately wanted to believe what they were seeing. Seraphine studied the false evidence carefully, and her pale fingers traced over the weapon schematics and ship designs, and she was so focused on the datapad that she failed to notice Shadowfang's golden eyes beginning to glow brighter, and she did not sense Lyra's ship silently repositioning itself outside the throne room's energy field. The pale queen finally looked up from the data and declared that this was excellent work, and told Envoy Mara that she would be greatly rewarded for her loyalty and service, and she invited Kate to drink with her to celebrate the coming destruction of the human threat. Seraphine extended her hand with her wrist turned upward and offered her own blood as a sign of favor and acceptance, and this was the exact moment that Kate had been dreading throughout the entire mission, because if she refused the offer, then Seraphine would immediately know something was wrong, but if she accepted and tried to drink, then the glamour spell would be revealed instantly, but before Kate could make any response. Shadowfang struck with devastating speed. The small black cat transformed mid-leap into his true massive dragon form, and he was so enormous that he shattered the entire western wall of the throne room, and his purple flames washed over Seraphine's bone throne, and the pale queen shrieked in pain and fury. Outside in space, Lyra's ship opened. Fire and its weapons were charged with ancient elven magic that had been designed specifically to kill vampires and the energy field. Protecting the throne room from vacuum flickered and died completely. Kate immediately dropped the glamour illusion and drew the plasma pistol that had been hidden in her uniform, and she fired point blank at Seraphine. But the vampire queen was impossibly fast, and she dodged with movements that blurred, and her hand closed around Kate's throat with crushing force that threatened to snap her neck. Fiend hissed the word human and called Kate the prophecy child, and said that Morgoth would reward her beyond all measure for delivering Kate's head. Kate struggled desperately as her vision began to blur from lack of oxygen, but she had not come to this fight unprepared, and her other hand pulled a small vial from her belt. And this vial contained holy water from Earth's most ancient monastery, and it had been blessed by priests of a dozen different faiths. Kate smashed the vial directly into Seraphine's face. The pale queen's scream could have shattered entire worlds, and she released Kate immediately and began clawing at her own burning flesh, and Shadowfang's massive jaws closed around Seraphine's body, and his dragonfire consumed her from within, and for 3,000 years she had terrorized the galaxy. But against the combined might of human defiance and elven magic and dragon fury, she had no chance of survival. Seraphine, the pale, crumbled into ash, and with her death alarms began screaming throughout the entire ends. Blood Eternal and the vampire fleet was waking up and realizing that their queen had fallen. Lyra shouted for them to leave immediately, and her ship swooped into the shattered throne room, and Kate grabbed Seraphine's command codes from the throne's control terminal and sprinted for the waiting vessel, and Shadowfang covered their escape with his roars and flames, keeping the vampire guards at bay as they blasted out of the doomed flagship. Kate activated Seraphine's final contingency protocol and sent a message to all vampire ships, declaring that their queen had been assassinated by agents working for Cassandra. The Whisper and Kate smiled grimly as she watched the vampire fleet begin to turn on itself. One sister queen down and 2 more to go, and only 5 days remaining before Morgoth reached Earth. 3 days had passed since Seraphine's death, and the galaxy was beginning to stir with rumors of rebellion and hope, and now Kate and Lyra and Shadowfang approached the inner colonies, where Cassandra, the Whisper, maintained her palace of mirrors. In secret, Cassandra was different from her sister Seraphine, because where the Pale Queen had ruled through military might, Cassandra controlled her territories through fear and paranoia and information, and she had spies embedded in every court, and every government, and every resistance cell across the known galaxy. Palace itself was a twisted marvel of architecture and engineering, and it floated in the void between 3 dead stars, and every surface was made of mirrors that reflected and distorted reality in impossible ways, and anyone who entered the palace could never be certain what was real and what was illusion. Lyra explained their strategy as they prepared their approach, and she said that Cassandra's greatest strength was also her fatal weakness, because the Whisper trusted no one and suspected everyone of plotting against her, and they would use that paranoia to destroy her. Kate asked how they could possibly get close to someone who had informants everywhere. Shadong spoke and said they would not try to hide from Cassandra's spies, but instead they would make sure those spies reported exactly what the dragon wanted them to. Here the plan was elegant in its simplicity, and they would allow themselves to be captured by Cassandra's agents, and they would carry false evidence that Morgoth had discovered Cassandra's secret ambition to overthrow her and claim the vampire empire for herself. And faced with what appeared to be proof of Morgoth's knowledge, Cassandra would have no choice but to strike first or flee, and either option would create the opening they needed. They landed their ship on a minor trade station in Cassandra's territory and made no attempt to hide their identities, and within hours agents of the Whisper surrounded them and demanded they surrender. Kate and Lyra allowed themselves to be taken, while Shadowfang remained hidden in cat form, and the agents brought them to the Palace of Mirrors and through corridors that twisted in ways that hurt to look at, and finally they were thrown into a cell that had mirrors for walls and ceiling, and Flor Cassandra appeared like smoke materializing from nothing, and she was tall and thin with eyes like chips of ice, and she moved with a grace that suggested she was always somewhere between shadow and substance. Whisper spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere and asked, "What brought the prophesied human and the last elf to her?" Domain Lyra answered and said they came bearing a warning, and pulled out a forged data crystal that supposedly contained intercepted communications between Morgoth and her death squads, and these communications allegedly ordered Cassandra's immediate execution. Cassandra took the crystal with trembling fingers and inserted it into a reader and watched the fabricated evidence with growing horror, and the false messages showed Morgoth discussing how Cassandra had grown too powerful and too independent and must be eliminated before she became a threat. The Whisper's paranoia was legendary, and seeing what appeared to be confirmation of her worst fears pushed her over the edge into panic, and she began pacing the mirrored cell and muttering to herself about betrayal and treachery. Kate spoke carefully and suggested that Cassandra could strike first, and with Seraphine already dead, Morgoth was vulnerable, and if Cassandra moved quickly she could seize control of the Empire. But Cassandra was not foolish, despite her paranoia, and she turned her icy gaze on Kate and asked why the human would help her. Kate told a partial truth and said that a vampire civil war would give Earth time to prepare its defenses, and humanity did not care which vampire won, as long as they destroyed each other. This logic appealed to Cassandra's suspicious nature, and she believed that enemies of Morgoth would naturally want to see the vampire queens fighting among themselves. The Whisper made her decision and declared that she would launch a preemptive strike against Morgoth's fortress, and she ordered her agents to prepare the fleet immediately as Cassandra turned to leave the cell. Lyra moved with speed that surprised even the ancient vampire in her starlight. Blade pierced through Cassandra's back and emerged from her chest. The Whisper's eyes went wide with shock and betrayal, and she tried to turn into shadow and escape, but Shadowfang revealed himself, and his purple flames surrounded the cell and burned away the shadows and left Cassandra with nowhere to hide. Kate drew her plasma pistol and fired 3 shots into the vampire queen's head, and Cassandra, the Whisper, crumbled to dust without ever understanding that she had been manipulated from the very beginning. Alarms shrieked through the palace, but Lyra knew the layout from her years of planning, and she led them through secret passages and hidden corridors while Cassandra's leaderless agents ran in confusion and panic. They reached their ship and blasted away from the Palace of Mirrors, and as they escaped, Kate activated a virus that Lyra had planted in Cassandra's communication network, and the virus sent messages to every resistant cell in the inner colonies, telling them that both Seraphine and Cassandra were dead, and the time to rise up had finally come too. Sister Queens had fallen, and the galaxy was beginning to believe that the impossible might actually be possible, but their hardest fight still lay ahead, because Victoria the Dread was the oldest and strongest of the 3 sister queens, and she ruled the prison world of Ashfall with absolute cruelty. That only 2 days left before Morgoth's fleet would reach Earth, the final battle was approaching fast. Ashfall was a world of fire and ash and volcanic fury, and it orbited so close to its red giant star that the surface was an endless hellscape of lava flows and toxic clouds, and deep beneath the burning surface lay the prison complex where Victoria the Dread kept thousands of the galaxy's greatest warriors locked in cells of blood magic. Kate looked out at the burning world and felt the weight of everything they had accomplished pressing down on her shoulders, and news had spread across a galaxy that 2 vampire queens were dead in less than a week, and resistant cells were stirring on 100 worlds unconquered. Peoples were beginning to remember what hope felt like, but if they failed here on Ashfall, then Victoria would crush them, and Morgoth would descend upon Earth with her full fury, and everything they had fought for would be lost. Lyra stood beside Kate as they prepared their weapons, and the elf spoke quietly and said that the ancient prophecy spoke of more than just immunity to vampire control, and it spoke of the Unbroken One breaking the chains that held the entire Galaxy in darkness, and this moment was what the prophecy had always meant. Kate checked her plasma rifle and said she was just a soldier. Doing her duty, Shadowfang rumbled in his deep voice and told Kate she had become far more than just a soldier, and she was now a symbol of resistance and the first human that the galaxy had ever seen, and the one who had shown countless beings that Morgoth could bleed and could be defeated. Prison Complex was a massive fortress carved directly into the largest volcano on Ashfall, and its gates were sealed with ancient blood magic, and its walls were patrolled by vampire knights who had served Victoria for centuries, and at the heart of the fortress, Victoria waited on a throne built from the bones of rebel leaders. She had personally killed. They did not attempt any infiltration this time because there was no point in trying, because Victoria already knew they were coming, since her spy network was nearly as good as Cassandra's had been, and news of their approach had surely reached her ears instead. They announced themselves openly, and without fear Shadowfang landed in his full dragon glory before the main gate and released a roar that shook the entire mountain and made the volcano tremble, and Kate and Lyra stood on his broad back with their weapons ready and their heads held high in defiance. The massive gates of blood forged metal opened slowly, and Victoria the Dread emerged from the darkness within, and she was completely unlike her sister queens, because she was not beautiful or elegant, but instead was terrifying in her raw physical power. The ancient vampire stood 3 times the height of a normal person, and muscles rippled beneath. Her gray skin and her eyes burned with hatred that had accumulated over thousands of years of cruelty and violence, and she was the first vampire that Morgoth had ever created, and her power was immense beyond measure. Victoria's voice was like grinding stone as she demanded to know how they dared to challenge her in her own fortress, and she promised to make them suffer for years before she would finally allow them to die. Kade shouted back that Victoria would have to catch them first. Battle that followed would be sung about in legends for generations to come, and Shadowfang clashed with Victoria in combat that shattered mountains, while Kate and Lyra fought through wave after wave of vampire knights as they pushed deeper into the fortress toward the prison cells where thousands of warriors waited for freedom. Lyra's starlight blades sang through the air, and each strike was guided by centuries of elven combat training, and Kate fought with human determination and cleverness, using everything from plasma weapons to improvised explosives made from the fortress's own power system. Shadowfang fought with the fury of a dragon who had watched his world burn 3,000 years ago, had finally found something worth fighting for again, and his purple flames consumed vampire knights by the dozens, and his claws tore through armor that had been forged in the blood of gods. They reached the central control room deep in the heart of the fortress, and Kate accessed the prison systems using codes that Lyra had stolen from Cassandra's files, and with a single command, every cell in the entire complex unlocked simultaneously. Of cell doors opened at once, and warriors from 100 different worlds burst free, and these were soldiers and rebels and heroes who had refused to kneel to Morgoth and had been locked away because they were too dangerous to kill and too defiant. 2 turned the battle transformed into a full revolution in moments. Victoria realized too late what had happened, and she found herself suddenly surrounded by thousands of enemies who had been waiting years for this exact moment, and her fortress was falling apart around her, and her knights were being overwhelmed. The ancient vampire made a desperate decision and reached out through the psychic network that connected all vampires across the galaxy and called to Morgoth herself and begged for Odin. Morgoth answered the call. The sky above Ashfall tore open as space itself was ripped apart, and the vampire queen's personal dreadnought emerged from hyperspace, and the very air trembled and shook with her presence and power. Morgoth's voice boomed across the entire battlefield and echoed from every wall, and she said that this game had gone on long enough, and the little human had proven stronger than expected, but now it would end. The vampire queen descended from her ship like a dark goddess, and every vampire on the planet immediately fell to their knees in worship, and even Victoria bowed low before her ancient mistress. But Kate and Lyra and Shadowfang remained standing. Tal Morgoth fixed her burning crimson eyes on Kate and told her that she had been offered a chance to kneel and been offered mercy, but now she would receive nothing except death. Kate's voice was steady, despite the overwhelming power radiating from the vampire queen, and she said that Morgoth could not turn her, or control her, or break her. And that was what truly terrified the vampire queen. After 3,000 years of ruling through domination and control, Morgoth raised her hand, and reality itself seemed to bend and warp around her gathered power. But before she could unleash that terrible force, a new sound cut through the darkness. And it was a horn blast, clear and bright, echoing down from orbit, and Kate looked up with tears streaming down her face. Sirth's fleet had arrived in the System 50 warships representing humanity's entire military strength emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, and they were not as large as vampire dreadnoughts, or as ancient as elven vessels, but they were crewed by humans who could not be turned and would not kneel, and who fought with desperate courage born from protecting their homeworld and Earth's fleet was not alone, because following close behind came ships bearing the flags of freed worlds and resistant cells and species who had found their courage again, and the entire galaxy was rising up in rebellion. Admiral Lisa Grant's voice crackled over the communication channels and told Lieutenant Morrison that the cavalry had arrived and apologized for being late. The final battle was chaos beyond description, and human ships fought with tactics that Morgoth had never encountered before, and they coordinated with precision that came from shared humanity. Rather than forced slavery, and the freed prisoners of Ashfall joined the fight with weapons seized from Victoria's armories. 3 rebel war leaders working together brought down Victoria the Dread and ended her reign of cruelty forever, and Shadowfang dueled Morgoth herself, and his ancient dragon magic matched her vampiric power blow for blow. In the end, Morgoth retreated from battle for the first time in 3,000 years, and her empire was fracturing, and her sister queens were dead, and the galaxy burned with rebellion, and she fled into deep space with what remained of her fleet. As the sun rose over Ashfall, and its light drove back the darkness, Kate stood among thousands of freed warriors and realized what they had accomplished together, and it was not just a military victory, but something far greater. They had proven that tyranny could be challenged, and that courage was contagious, and that one person refusing to kneel could inspire an entire galaxy. Stand Lyra placed her hand on Kate's shoulder and said the prophecy was fulfilled, because the Unbroken One had broken the chains of slavery. Kate replied that the war was not over yet, because Morgoth would return eventually. Wishedfang spread his enormous wings and told her to let Morgoth come, because the galaxy was awake now, and they would be ready and waiting. Earth's fleet formed up alongside the rebel armada, and humans and aliens worked together for the first time in history, and it was the beginning of something new and something better. Kate Morrison had arrived at the Galactic Council as a simple observer, taking notes, and she left as a living legend, and the human who refused to kneel, and the catalyst that sparked a revolution. And somewhere in the darkness of deep space, Morgoth plotted her eventual return, not knowing that she had already lost the only battle that truly mattered, because she had lost the hearts and minds of the galaxy. And no amount of power could ever win those back again. The war was far from over, but for the first time in 3,000 years the future was uncertain, and the galaxy dared to hope.